Coming up on the Branding Deep Dive podcast.
I think about this how big of a pain point are we solving, and how frequently does that pain point happen, right? Maybe I really hate buying Christmas gifts, and it's a huge pain point if you help me solve my Christmas gift buying problem. But that only happens once a year. So multiply those two things together, mediocre kind of pain point. I'm not going to really tell my friends about it. It doesn't happen enough. But it's something that happens to you every business day, and it's kind of painful. Great.
This is Ahmed Chima, and welcome to the Branding Deep Dive podcast. If you're new here, this is a podcast where we have in-depth discussions with founders, marketers, and brand strategists on how to build a brand that people love. Today, we're talking to Richard White. Richard is the founder and CEO of Fathom.video, a free app that records, transcribes, and highlights your calls so you can focus on the conversation instead of taking notes. Fathom was a part of Y-Combinator's Winter 21 batch, is one of only 50 Zoom app launch partners, and is one of a small handful of companies Zoom has invested in directly via their Zoom Apps Fund. Prior to Fathom, Richard founded UserVoice, one of the leading platforms that technology companies from startups to the Fortune 500 use for managing customer feedback and making strategic product decisions. UserVoice was notable for being the company that originally invented the feedback tab shown on the side of millions of websites around the world today. Richard previously worked on Kiko, a company in the first batch of Y-Combinator with Justin Kan and Emmett Shear, who subsequently went on to found Twitch. Richard is passionate about designing intuitive productivity tools with delightful user experiences. In this episode, we dive deep into how to properly cold email, the benefits of working at a startup, when to monetize your startup, how to get and implement product feedback, the benefits of going through Y-Combinator, and much, much more. If you're looking to build a startup, this episode is a must listen. Now, here's Richard. For the audience that may not be familiar with who you are and Fathom, can you give them a brief introduction?
Sure. So my quick background, I'm an engineer turned designer turned, serial entrepreneur. I worked in a company in the first batch of Y-Combinator, which is a very famous kind of seed incubator. I worked with the guys that went on to do Twitch. So I'm the answer to a trivia question, who worked with these guys before they were famous. And then I started this company called UserVoice. UserVoice is probably most famous for, if you've ever seen little feedback tabs on the side of websites, we kind of pioneered that, ran that company for 10, 12 years, multi-million dollars of revenue. And then 2 years ago, during the pandemic, started Fathom. And Fathom was basically a reaction to being on a lot of Zoom calls. And I am, as I like to say, I'm kind of single-threaded. My girlfriend knows as well. If I'm writing, I can't talk. And if I'm talking, I can't write. And so it was very painful to have a bunch of Zoom calls and trying to take notes and talk to customers at the same time. And Fathom was kind of a reaction to that. Let's build a meeting assistant that can join every call, record the call, transcribe the call, do it fast so you get that stuff as soon as the call ends, and then give you a fun little interface where whenever you hear something important, you just click a button in our app, and we'll basically highlight that part of the call in the post-call summary. And so, we've been starting for 2 years. It's completely free product based on built for people on Zoom calls, and it's just been a fun ride.
Yeah, I'm not on that many Zoom calls, but I did see the demo. It seems so cool. I was just thinking, if I could have something like that for my podcast, it would save me a lot of work on the back end. I want to start at the beginning here. You mentioned you worked with Justin Kan and Emmett Shear. You didn't mention them by name, but the guys that started Twitch. Yep. I want to ask you is, how did you get that job at that first startup? I think a lot of people that may be listening, or myself, I'll just say, I don't know how to actually go about, if I want, I always wanted to work at a startup. How do I actually go about, making these connections and putting myself out there in front of the right people?
Well, it's funny. So I grew up in North Carolina, and I tried to do a bunch of startups as a teenager and in college. And I constantly kind of struggled to find people to do a startup with me. If people didn't want to do that, they wanted to go work at a normal company. And I remember one day I was at my normal company job, and I had been talking to a colleague I want to really build this thing. And he kind of, sent me a link. It's there's a TechCrunch article. Someone built the thing you wanted to build. And I was I was kind of sad for a minute. I was oh, bummer. I wanted to do that. And then I started playing around with the product, and I was oh, wow, this is technically very capable, but my gosh, the design of this is really bad. And so I like reached out to the founders. I don't know how I found their email address, but I like reached out to them and was like, this product is technically, like, I kind of like complimented them. Like, product is very technically amazing. And then I was like, but it's designed like crap. Like, you can't find any of these features. It's very confusing, blah, blah. And then I offered to help. I was like, I'd be happy to, I fancy myself, I was a designer, right? And I want to help you with this sort of thing. And I think they told me kind of in a sea of, they were getting a lot of positive emails. Mine kind of stood out because that's the only one being like, your thing could be better. Like, it's actually not that good. And it was, kind of a long email. And to their credit, they like replied back and were like, okay, yeah, tell us how. And like, we started kind of working together, and that's kind of how it happened, right? At some point they were like, oh, this is a better design for our product. Yeah. Do you want to come work with us? Said, sure, I'd love to. So that's how it kind of got started. Cold email.
Now, was that a tough decision to leave your normal job to go work at a startup for you?
It's a good question. So long ago, I don't think so, because I think I, always knew I wanted to do a startup thing, and like I was pretty passionate about working on this thing, and it felt like an opportunity. I think one of the reasons you go work at a startup is to go do something you're not really qualified to do. And in this case, I was an engineer. I wasn't really qualified to be a product designer, but it's what I wanted to do. And so I was like, oh, here's an opportunity to build a thing I want to build, solve a problem I want to solve, and do a role that I want to do, even though most people probably wouldn't pay me to do it. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it was that hard. I think at that point in my life, my overhead was pretty low, which is good because my salary was even lower. They're like, how much do you want to get paid? And I was like, I'll get paid whatever you're getting paid. Wrong answer. Like, really dumb answer, because they were paying themselves like nothing. But no, I think, obviously in retrospect, it's paid for itself in other ways, like orders of magnitude over. But a lot of the best experiences a lot of the big, I think, turns in my career have always actually come from like cold emails to people. Do
you have any principles or best practices for writing good cold emails that actually get read and responded to?
I mean, it's interesting. I get a lot of cold emails, but like 98% of them are just like clearly not just written to me. Everyone so focuses on like, I gotta get scale. I gotta get this in 30 people's inboxes. You can tell the email that was only written to you. Right. And it's not the sales hack thing of like, oh, line 1, say something, with their name in it. Line 2, say something that shows you've read their LinkedIn. No, like the whole email needs to read like, this is a thing I like want to reach out to you. There's something exciting here. Right. So there's probably this happy medium. I remember many, many years ago being on dating apps. And I remember before I went on dating apps, I was asking my female friends, like, what are the messages that you get look like? And they showed me. And then what I saw was like a lot of guys who send girls messages are like one line, hey, you're cute. Well, that's it, right? Like, oh, hey. And then other guys would send these like War and Peace level, like, 5-paragraph essay of why they should go on a date with them. And so I always found a way to like strike something in the middle that kind of is like not so short and not so long. And I think same thing applies to cold emails. It's kind of like dating emails where you want something that shows like this is a specific email to you, but also isn't so big that like I feel overwhelmed to try to respond to it. Right. That's the thing. I occasionally get those too, where it's just wall of text and I'm like, what to do with it? It also subtly implies that like you have too much time on your hands too to write this. Like it like has this like subtle signaling about the power dynamic, which I think is not very positive for you. But you keep it short, right? Like, oh, this thing's super cool. Design can be better. I can help you. Let me know. Right. Like, yeah.
Now, you mentioned one of the reasons to actually go out and work at a startup is to, try something that you normally wouldn't get paid to do or be allowed to do.
Are there any qualified for? Yeah,
or not qualified for, right? Now, when it comes to like our audience, I think a lot of people are probably in the traditional job route. Are there any other like benefits or like when you talk to people that are considering, making the leap and joining a startup? I'm sure you probably have people that want to work for you that are kind of on the fence. Like, what are the benefits of working at a startup besides that, getting to do stuff you're not qualified for?
I mean, I think it's optimizing for growth and learning, right? Like that's what getting to do things you're not qualified for is all about, right? And I think so. That's one thing, right? It's like there's a period in my life where I would do freelancing and then do startups and do freelancing, and I felt like generally freelancing, I was like cashing out of what I already knew. I wasn't learning a lot in that. Usually I was taking what I'd learned at the startup and then like, great, I can take these learnings and apply them to you for an hourly rate, right? But the reason I was able to charge $150 an hour hourly rate back in the day or whatever was because I did the startup work at like well below market that like built up my like knowledge base internally, right? So I think that's one of the benefits. I think, the other big benefit is if you can, and this is where it gets tricky, if you can find the right startup at the right stage, there's usually also other ambitious, smart people working there. And like finding those people is probably sometimes the most valuable thing, right? Like, I'm still friends with Justin and Emmett to this day. They're fantastic people. They're super ambitious, super smart, and they really enriched my life. And that happened because I went to go work at the startup. That would have not have probably happened. And you can meet folks at non-startups too. But I just think if you care about entrepreneurship, right, the hardest thing is going to be to find your tribe of other people that are like that kind of ambitious, because it's not the default. And so, it's why people always are like struggling to find co-founders, right? Because it's like hard to find other people that want to do this. But if you go work at a couple of early stage startups, they're generally filled with everyone there has that bias, right? So getting things learning things at a faster rate than you would otherwise because you're allowed to fail faster than you would anywhere else, right? Like large companies are designed to not let things fail, which means by nature, you don't really get to learn as much as you can as a startup where things are failing all the time, right?
Right.
And building your network. And so that's why I think early in your career, it's way more valuable to join a startup than it is later in your career in some ways, right? Because those relationships and that learning, you almost want to front load that, and then you can kind of like it pays out over time, as opposed to like going to do a normal corporate job for 15 years and then switching to startups. Well, not to mention your like overhead is now higher, but like you don't get the fruits of that annuity for as long as if you started earlier.
That's a really good way to put it. I want to transition into user voice. So you were helping out with design at the first startup with Emmett and Justin, and then you started user voice on your own. Can you walk us through how you came up with the idea? And then really what I want to dive into here is how you actually got the word out and got people to start using your product. I think that's one of the big black boxes nowadays. So,
it's interesting. I think all the startups I've worked on, I think for the most part, have one thing in common, which is like I was solving a problem I was intimately familiar with already that I had. And so like, you heard me talk about Fathom. At User Voice, I had this problem of like, I'm on all the Zoom calls. I hate taking notes. Those notes also don't translate well into sharing my experience with the team. Hence Fathom. At Kiko, which is the company Justin Emmett and I worked on, our problem was we had 5,000 daily active users, and I spend a lot of time as a designer reading through all their feedback emails, trying to figure out what we should build next, and just being overwhelmed by this and spending hours a day trying to figure out like what are people frustrated about. And User Voice was kind of a reaction to that, like, oh, here's like a way to crowdsource the organization of our feedback so that we can show up and just see, oh, here's the top 10 things we want, and here's who wants them, and be able to message back to them. And so in a lot of ways, I've generally focused on building solutions to the problem I've had at my previous business roles. But I think your question is a great one that people don't ask enough. And frankly, I probably didn't ask enough at User Voice in the early days, which is like, what's our go-to-market? How, like, we could solve this problem. How are we going to get this in the hands of enough people? At User Voice, it started off with, I just showed it to my friends who were also building companies and also had this like product feedback problem. And then I actually brought someone onto the team whose sole job was to just go talk to other people building like founders of other basically software companies on Twitter and in person, and be like, convince them, hey, you should use our free product, right? Get it on your website. And then we kind of naturally stumbled into a product where User Voice was like this, almost like, think of it as like this suggestion box you set up on your website. And all the users of so we'd sign up company A, all the users of company A would see it. And then some percentage of the users also had their own company. And then they would be like, oh, I want that thing on my. So there's like this natural kind of virality to it. Same things happen with Fathom, right? Where it's like except for this time, I kind of went into this company knowing we need to have a solution for how we're going to get our first 1,000 users and how to get our first 10,000 users, right? And, I almost now won't start a company unless I know how to answer that question. Because increasingly there's just not a lot of options to do that.
It's interesting. When I had Parthi on, he mentioned something very similar where he mentioned that nowadays code is actually becoming a commodity more and more. And really what differentiates you is your distribution strategy and your ability
100%.
to get distribution. And so can you walk us through how you're thinking? I mean, you mentioned your thinking has changed, but like, how do you actually think through getting that first 1,000 users? Like if you had to start another company today, what are the channels that you generally think through? Or like, I guess maybe we can get more specifically into Fathom and like, how did you think through that and where did you focus your energies there?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think when you're just starting out, you think of like marketing and customer acquisition as kind of like this open-ended question. When actually, once you get some experience, you realize it's a multiple choice question. It's actually a single choice question, right? So, for example, what you typically do is you go look at a company, let's go look at Airbnb, and you look at what they're doing for marketing, acquire customers. You go, okay, we need a blog, we need a podcast, we need some ads, we need that, because they do all the things, right? They do every marketing channel possible. And then startups try to copy that. The problem is almost every startup when it was starting only had like one channel, right? It was like, Zynga had basically the Facebook apps, right? If you remember back in the day, you had like all these like back in like the SEO days, you had like SEO was driving like eHow and like all these different wiki type things, right? Like what happens is, these kind of marketing channels open up and for a period of time, they are undervalued. And then at some point they become completely saturated. And once they're completely saturated, you can't win, right? So for example, I would argue like ads at this point are rapidly approaching that or pretty much have already approached that in almost every market, right? So you can't win. You can't just build a B2B product and then say, I'm going to buy ads against it at scale unless you have something completely new or completely new vertical, But it's really hard, right? So you kind of got to look for like a Northwest Passage. Or you need to look for products that like lend themselves to word of mouth because that's the one thing that actually has been amplified over the last 10 years, right? Word of mouth is now on steroids, right? There's this weird period where if you go back, I think 30, 40 years, word of mouth was really strong. And then you had all of these top-down things, right? Like television ads and newspaper ads. You had all this advertising stuff kind of was able to like it didn't matter whether you had word of mouth. You just spend your way into customer acquisition, right? And then all those channels got to be about the same price. It actually turns out recently, like the cost of sending a letter to someone's inbox, a mailbox, like physical mailbox, is like the same as running a newspaper ad is the same as buying a Google ad, right? Like it basically reaches equilibrium. And so you have to, in this new market, like now social media, we've kind of, like I said, amplified the original thing, which everyone used, which was word of mouth. And now word of mouth is relevant again. And so you have all of these companies, early, especially coming in this market, all these companies refocusing on word of mouth. And we knew for Fathom going in that there's going to be a strong word of mouth component to it because it solves this very personal problem. And you run into this problem all the time, right? If you're someone who's using Zoom, you're not using it once a week, you're using it every day, multiple times a day. So if we can help you with a thing that I think about this, like how big of a pain point are we solving and how frequently does that pain point happen, right? Maybe I really hate buying Christmas gifts and it's a huge pain point if you help me solve my like Christmas gift buying problem. But that only happens once a year. So like multiply those two things together, mediocre kind of pain point. I'm not going to really tell my friends about it. It doesn't happen enough. But it's like something happens to you every business day and it's kind of painful. Great. That alone is that. And then we also knew that the way the app was going to function is it's going to bring this like, note taker person, like it's basically a bot onto the call to record it. And that's going to necessitate you saying, hey, Emmett, I'm going to record this call with this cool tool I've got. And I'm naturally going to end up telling you about it. And you're naturally going to get like a after call summary about it. And then you're going to be like, after enough exposure to that thing, you're going to try it yourself. And that's what we started with. And then early in the journey, the news came out that Zoom was launching this new marketplace. And so new marketplaces are also these kind of like, Haley's Comet type events, right? Like you could count on the number on like two hands, the number of marketplaces launched by large companies in the last 10 years, right? It's not a lot. And marketplace opportunities are rare. And if you can get on the ground floor, they're usually good because usually the first people get the signups and then usually the thing gets sorted by which apps have been getting used the most. And like, it's like first mover advantage, right? The rich get richer sort of thing. And so we kind of got really lucky in that Zoom just happened to announce its marketplace at the same time. And so we combined.
You guys had no idea it was happening, though.
We had no idea what was happening when we were starting the company.
Oh, wow.
We had a completely different go-to-market process, which was going to be like really low and slow. We're going to do some outbound, do some like unscalable things to get to like 100 people, 1,000 people. And then we're confident that the engine would kick in and the virality would kick in. And it just so happened we were able to go get involved in the Zoom platform, which also was a cold email to Zoom. We weren't originally involved in this platform. I found the right person and cold emailed them and got into being a launch partner for this platform. And then we had like this really nice, not repeatable, but organic stream. And then we married that with our virality, and it's, really taken off. So anyway, so that's a long answer to say like, there's not a lot of channel. Like I think you could start more from like what channels exist today that aren't oversaturated in any given market. Because for the most part, outbound emails are oversaturated, right? Like ads are oversaturated. You can't buy a LinkedIn ad. You gotta come up with some way that you're going to get to users at the scale you need to get to. Now, again, if you've got an enterprise product, if you got a product that you're going to charge 6 figures for, well, gosh, you don't need that much of a channel because you don't, for us, we're trying to reach millions and millions of people that are on Zoom calls. So like we need a big channel, but you just need to find a channel that's big enough to support your ASP.
Now, one of the things I had in my notes here is that, so Kiko was part of YC, User Voice was not, am I correct?
Correct.
And then now Fathom is again part of a YC. So I'm really curious to see why you decided to go back the YC route. It seems like you already have the network, you already have the connections, you already been through the curriculum, I'd assume. What value does YC provide for you as someone who's a seasoned operator, basically?
Yeah, it's interesting. So with Kiko, I was actually an employee. So I came in like right after the YC curriculum officially had ended. But it is true that I think for many years, people just assumed I went through YC because I knew everyone in that like cohort, right? I just like, from the first batch, just known so many folks. And so it was an interesting decision for Fathom. It was easy for User Voice because this is when User Voice was starting. It was when YC was bi-coastal. It used to be California and Boston. And I would have had to move back to Boston, which I just came from, to like go through YC. I was like, Boston's terrible. I'm not going back there. It's cold. It's not terrible. You people are lovely. It's just cold, too cold for me. For Fathom, I think I look at Fathom as like a speed run of a video game called Startups, right? Where it's like, I feel like your second time through, it's like playing Minecraft, right? Playing Minecraft the first time, you don't know what you're doing. And you kind of spend an hour trying to figure out you're supposed to punch a tree to get wood. An hour into your second Minecraft experience, right? Or like you play it 10 years later, it's like, within like an hour, you've got a castle and like a moat and all this sort of stuff, right? And I feel like Fathom was the speed run of like, let's do all the sort of things. Let's highly parallelize this and do it really fast. And one of those things YC is just kind of like it makes things faster. It makes fundraising faster, right? Like, could we have raised money without YC? Certainly, right? We've done the company without YC? Yes. Were we faster because we went through YC? Yes. Was it because of the curriculum? Not as much, because like I've done this long enough that like that curriculum was a little more like 101, 201 level to me. But it was the social accreditation, the social proof, right? So it's helped with fundraising. It's also helped with hiring, right? Like in a world where there's tons of competition, people say, "Oh, I want to work at a YC company," and it's blah blah. And then one of the biggest X factors is like, I think it's really important to have a group of peers that are like in the arena at the same time you are. Because a lot of these tactics, like a lot of these go-to-market tactics, are changing. By the time you read about some marketing tactic in a book or a blog, it's over. It doesn't work anymore for the most part, right? Unless you're in some like niche blog, right? And so it's cool to be able to converse with people or meet people that are in adjacent verticals, right? Not my competition, but executing, there's enough companies in the past, you'll find a handful of them if you search them out that, have the same kind of ASP, the same go-to-market motion, whatnot. And you can kind of compare notes. And that's super, super valuable because a lot of the stuff on the edge is clandestine knowledge. It's not, again, in a book or on a blog post. So I think you could probably value YC just on the like hiring and fundraising like accelerant. But I think the unknown X factor is just kind of like you get intel on like what tools to use and what tactics not to try and who's doing what sort of thing faster than you would otherwise.
Now, let me ask you this. So Fathom is a free product. And I guess my question is, what's the plan for Fathom to generate revenue? What does that look like?
Oh, that's right, because we got to generate revenue now. It's a brave new world. Can't just give things away forever for free anymore. And this is another thing where like we did something a little bit unique. I think a lot of companies start off charging from day one, and we knew we didn't want to do that because we wanted it. It's tough to do growth and monetization at the same time. You kind of tend to then do both kind of crappily, right? And then you end up with a low monetization company. And you're like, well, now can't fundraise on it and whatnot. So for us, we really want to focus on let's prove we can get like really good growth, user growth for free, right? This is all word of mouth. We're not paying no marketing spend. That alone, building that engine is probably one of the highest risk things we can do. We can build that engine. We have some hypotheses of like how we can make money off that engine. We first need to prove we can build that engine. Because if we can't build that engine, then monetizing that engine isn't that interesting, right? It's like, we never proved how to really get growth. So even if I can do a decent job of monetization, it's never going to grow that fast, right? So like figure out like what's the key part, and the key part was that engine. And then we always had this thesis that we can at some point charge like a manager at a team as opposed to the individuals. We'll get individuals to sign up. It's going to be a salesperson, a CS person, a founder. They're going to start using it. And then at some point we'll see 2 people at the company, 3 people at the company, and then we're going to reach out to someone and say, hey, seems like you're liking this. We have another version of our product, which is for teams. You should roll this out to all of them. And that's kind of how I've been thinking about it. That's what we're doing now. So
it sounds like you're saying that if you're in the startup world, it's a good idea to just focus on growth rather than focus on monetizing. And I guess like if you don't have that
depends
growth,
on the product you're doing. Right. Like I think for our product, it was important, right? Like, so for certain products, like it's, they're B2B companies, so like you need to prove early on how much you're willing to pay for the thing. And that's like one of the key things to figure out. How much people are willing to pay for our thing is kind of somewhat bounded. Like we weren't as worried that people wouldn't be able to pay for this. There were comps in the market. There were other companies in the market that were doing interesting things with call recording and whatnot. Granted for specific niches like sales, but it kind of anchored what we could charge for it. And like we didn't get a lot of pushback of people saying like, would you eventually pay $30 a month for this sort of thing? So for us, it was we need to go figure out growth because we're almost this like prosumer product, right? That was a big part of our go-to-market story. I think for a lot of folks, the go-to-market story, it gets proven by the revenue, right? It's like, let's make sure we can close it. For us, it was different. And we look much more like a consumer company because of that. But I do think there's this thing where I do sometimes see companies try to do both at the same time. And I'm like, a lot of for B2B companies, they probably should do it at the same time. But if you're not pure B2B or you have the strong freemium model, I don't know, both User Voice and Fathom, I did like first year or so of the company was completely free. And it just removes this barrier to adoption. It just allows you to focus on like, if I can't give the thing away, then I know I can't sell the thing, right? Like, and anyways, getting pricing right is hard, right? And like, with User Voice, we were going to launch pricing on day one, and we pulled it out the 11th hour because I was like, I just don't know enough what people will charge, and I don't want to try to answer 2 questions at the same time. Can this be valuable to you, and also guess how valuable it is, right? I think it's also easy to charge once the thing becomes more established, right? It's like, I don't want to pay money for this thing. It's free and just got started and might go out of business tomorrow. Like it just, I don't know. So yeah, I'm a big fan of like delay monetization. Make sure you have the growth first, but if you have the right business model for that.
And it sounds like you're saying that if you don't have, like if you're in the consumer space and you don't have the growth, then it's harder to fundraise.
Right. Yeah. You're never going to, because again, the scale of users you eventually need to get to is so large. If you don't know, like you're not going to be able to cold email your way into that number of folks. Right. So, yeah.
I want to shift gears a little bit. I know, so you have engineering background and also design background, and then I would say what we can call product background here, building products and shipping them. I want to ask you how, like, you think through, especially, as someone who was the founder of User Voice, how do you think through, product roadmaps and actually taking feedback and making changes to your product based on the feedback you're getting, optimizing? Like, how does at your level, what are you thinking through? How do you guide your teams on, hey, these are the data points we need to be collecting, especially in the startup space where you may not have that many data points. You don't know as much of what people want, and a lot of it may just be conversations you're having with people. So how do you know what to put emphasis on, what not to, that kind of thing?
Yeah, and I think this is where the product discipline is as much art as it is science, especially at the early days, right? And I tend to like the framework of, so on road mapping at early stage, I don't think we have more than a month of a roadmap, right?
Oh, really?
Maybe we have vague notions on like 2 months. We have some big I've got some big thematic sense, right? So for example, when I started the company, I said, hey, look, we're going to first focus on a great single player experience, right? And because that's how we build the engine. We have to build something that's an awesome product experience people will want to tell their friends about. Once we feel like we've really nailed that, what's a milestone for that going to look like, right? It's going to look like high retention rates, high virality, right? Decent growth, right? And then we'll go into phase 2, and phase 2 will look like, then we're going to work on it at the team level. How do we make a great team experience, collaboration with team? And then we've got a third level, but I'm not going to tell you what the third level is. But so and those are almost like year-long kind of themes, right? So they're like,
I see.
And I think you get a lot of that guidance, like thematic roadmaps of like, here's the problem we're going to solve, here's the metrics we're going to move, right? Obviously, at the team now we're in phase 2 at teams. The metrics we're looking at are like cost acquisition, ASP, all the revenue type stuff, right? Customer churn, stuff like that. And then inside of each one of those phases, I've got probably 3 months worth of projects, but I only ever like put like a month worth of them of like, here's kind of what we're doing next, right? And a lot of that is the earlier you are, the more it's guided by like your own internal intuition. I think before starting the company, I like interviewed like 100 users of one of the existing market competitors, and interviewed I think probably equal number of people that were prospective users. And oh, by the way, again, remember, I'm also the target user, right? Like I'm a founder on a bunch of Zoom calls. So that's the like product management hack. It's like if you are the target user and you can be reasonably objective about what things you hate running into and what your problems are, it makes shortcuts a lot of this stuff. Where I think product feedback at our scale now becomes really valuable is more in the like rough edges, where there's this framework that the folks at Atlassian came up with. It's called Rough. And basically said, take all of your feedback and put it into either as a reliability focused, usability focused, or functionality focused. And whatever is the highest number is what you should be focused on, right? So, and you generally work in order of those. Like you work on like, okay, we want to get rid of any reliability issues. That was kind of what we did with Fathom, like aggressively go after bugs, make sure if there are any issues, we message users before they even notice they happen, like aggressive about reliability, because again, it's kind of a real-time system. And then we focus a lot on like making sure things are super usable. And I think this is where people get lost. Fixing bugs seems kind of table stakes. Building out a lot of features feels table stakes. Making those features work really well tends to be the part where I see generally the biggest point of opportunity. So we keep track of all these little usability issues. And where my team flags one to me, I kind of weigh in on like, yep, that's a usability issue, put it on the list. And if they don't, or I'm like, oh, that's a bug, or oh, that's actually they want a feature. Put it on the feature board on our user voice, obviously. So we keep track of all features and integration requests and stuff like that. And then I have this big long list of all these usability issues. And as we're building out things on the roadmap, I just happen to be like, oh, people are working in this area of the product. Let's go grab all the usability issues for that area of the product and kind of fix them while we're in there, right? Because I know from being an engineer, what you hate as an engineer is switching back between different parts of the app. Like it's almost like, think about it. An engineer's like, I get into a piece of the app and I load all of that into memory, into my head. And now I understand this area of the app. And so if you ask me to unload it to go look at another area of that map, you pay this cost of like, oh, I've got to go like learn about this other area. So while I'm in the headspace of an area and I understand it, because it takes a while to understand it, great, let's go solve all the problems related to this, the roadmap items and any existing usability issues. So we have a pretty tight pipeline on that. to get feedback from users.
No, when you initially said that, I started laughing a little bit because we're at work right now. We're going through our roadmap, and so the way we're doing it is where we plan out for the whole year. Is like how many resources are going to be applied to each thing, and I think I think there's two things. I think like one of the things at a startup, you have the it's more like fail fast and just fix quickly mentality rather than kind of think too much about everything. And maybe you don't necessarily have all the data to, support all the decisions anyway at the start. And the other piece is like, I've tried a few things on the side myself. I mean, nothing like picked off yet, but like what I found is when I'm starting out, things are just not as clear for me personally. Like I just don't know where to be focusing on. And like the more I do, the more it gets clear. And so I want to just, for you, I mean, you've built, multiple successful businesses. So is that kind of the same for you where like, when you're first starting out or like, I guess Fathom, you already had built, user voice. So when you were building out Fathom, did you have more of a clear idea of what the product would look like in the end state, or was it a little bit fuzzy and you came together as you were building it out?
It was less fuzzy than with user voice, but it was still fuzzy. I mean, I think the thing I focus more on now, I think that was more some of my cardinal sins from earlier in my career, were there's a framework called jobs to be done. And the shorthand version is like, think about the problem you're solving, make sure you solve the problem end to end, rather than just building a feature that solves one part along that journey, right? So, for example, for Fathom, one first thing we built out is like, we record the call, we transcribe it, we like highlight it, like you can develop this like really nice summary, like copy and paste it, drop it in a Google Doc. And that was a decent product. But then we went and talked to salespeople and realized, oh no, like the job to be done is not that. The job is not done, until I get that information in my CRM. As a salesperson, my job, like the meeting didn't happen unless I logged it in my CRM and I put in my meeting notes. So we had done 90% of the work, but we didn't do the last step, which was like get it to your CRM. You still had there's an air gap. You had to do that yourself. And once we built out our CRM sync and like, great, now you just click a few buttons and Fathom and like, boom, like we do everything. And then like that is, we accomplished that entire job now, not 90% of it. And the difference between accomplishing 90% of a job and 100% of the job is everything, right? Like massive increase in user retention. So, we tend to think of these things as like, I'm going to pick off some part of it. But at the end of the day, it's binary, right? You either got to 100% or you didn't, right? And I think early in my career, I made the mistake of like I was solving 3 jobs to be done that a user was hiring the product to do, if you will. And I was getting like a 70% done on 3 different axes of attack, right? And much better to like focus down and be like, and again, this is also why having that simplification of like, we were only focusing on a single player experience, right? That gave us the blinders to say anything comes in about like people using this as a team, we don't care. We're not going to work on it, right? It's not what our focus is right now. Great. We're focusing down what users want. And then within that, here's 3 or 4 things they're trying to solve for. Let's go get really good at this one. Okay, now that this one's really good, let's get really good at this one. Instead of like, oh, okay, we're going to give, a few, it's like you're doing a RPG game and like you go all the way down one talent tree before you build out the next one, right? Don't kind of like, you're not like a half mage, half warrior, half priest, right? Like you're a mage or you're a priest, right? And so I think that strategy has served me very well. And you can almost always ask the question of like, what would the user do from here, right? Where would they go after this, right? And just keep asking yourself that question until the answer is like, oh no, they're done. Oh, okay, great. Like now you've reached the end of that job you're done, right? And we ask the question, where do these notes go next? Oh, they go here. Great. Now where do they go? Oh, now they're basically done. Great, we're done. We can go on the next thing.
Yeah, no, that's a really good way to look at it. I want to close with, of course, I'll give you a chance to let everyone know how to sign up for Fathom and, if they want to follow you or your journey, that kind of thing. But before we get into that, any advice you have for new entrepreneurs or people that are looking to start a startup? Like, what do you tell them, especially now that we're looking at, like a recession, hard economic times, that kind of thing? What's your advice for people that are looking at this path?
I think the things that have always served me the best in my career, where I joined up with other people, where I found ways to like include people into my thing, right? Where I felt like I got the lowest ROI in my career is where I just try to like dogmatically go it alone on something because I really believed in something. So it's like I think people sometimes get overly passionate about their early stage idea and be like, it's not as valuable as you think, right? And if you can't convince people to join you on it, then it's definitely not that valuable, right? This is why a lot of these YC and everyone says like, oh, we prefer non-single founders. We prefer people who have co-founders. Well, the reason is because if you convince someone else who's reasonably smart to do this thing with you, it's not like, it can't be that stupid of an idea, right? And so I just think being a joiner, and also like sometimes while you're pride and be like, this thing's really interesting, like I did, right? Rather than hearing about Kiko and being like, I want to go build a competitor to Kiko, I was like, I want to try to join Kiko. They're already working on the thing I want to work on. And so I think a lot of us, I've talked to folks like, I think a lot of us grew up in areas where we were the most entrepreneurial person we knew, right? That's who I was, right? And so then I early on, like even around my career, started thinking like, no one else, I'm just gonna always have to go it alone, right? And I immediately and thankfully I had this opportunity to shift that mindset early in my career, and I think it was very valuable. I think also down markets are a great time to be doing startups, right? Because your opportunity cost is going to get lower because the like big company payouts are going to be not there, right? It was harder to do a startup the last couple of years because you're giving up on a FANG job and all the options that come with it, sort of thing. Right. Well, now, like those aren't as plentiful, sort of thing. So, and it tends to wash out all of frankly, I look back to 10 years ago. I just moved back to San Francisco, and I think San Francisco is having a renaissance right now because all of the like late stage employees have left. Right? Like the growth PM at Uber isn't living here anymore. They moved to Austin or wherever. And this town is back to being like very focused on like early stage entrepreneurs. And I think in general, it's also happening where like the people that are working on things are working on because they like really like working on them. They like the problem space, not because they're in startup land with a shovel on their shoulder because they heard there's gold here, sort of thing. Right. And so it's just going to clear out. It's going to clear out the noise. It's going to make it easier to hire once you do hit that vein of gold and you're like, we're on to something. I told my team, I was like, yeah, I kind of, in some ways we wish we had raised our Series A last year in the like, and back in 2021 in the hubbub of all the craziness. That'd been nice. But we couldn't have if that market had stayed that way, it'd been really hard to deploy that capital in any meaningful way. You couldn't hire anyone. Like people who were raising tens of millions of dollars still couldn't hire any engineers because everyone else was raising tens of millions of dollars, right? And so, I think opportunities happen when there's asymmetry, and there wasn't a lot of asymmetry last year. So, in the last couple of years. So, yeah, I think it's a good time.
I'm from Michigan originally, and I have the same kind of experience where everything I've tried is like at a certain point, the people that I'm trying it with, they just get bored of it, or they're like, no, I need to focus on something else now. It's just like so frustrating. So, I appreciate that advice.
I thought at some point I was like, I almost kind of gave up on entrepreneurship. I was like, no, I seem to be the only one that cares about this. And then I found my tribe at like YC and was like, oh no, there's other people that love playing this video game too. Right. So I think some folks look at this and like, that sort of thing looks exhausting. And I'm like, no, it's like the most fun. Look at all the levers you get to pull here. Right. Like, oh, but you could fail. Yeah, I know. It wouldn't be any fun of a game if you couldn't fail at it. So,
right.
Yeah.
And then for the people that are interested in Fathom, and also you, do you post on social media?
I'm only on LinkedIn. So if you find me on LinkedIn, feel free to message me. I try to wade through all of my inbound recruiter spam about once a week to respond back to people. Yeah, and if you want to check out Fathom, it's just Fathom.video, and you can just sign up for free and download the app.
Cool. Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you, Emmett.
Now, as always, I have my key takeaways from this episode, but before we get into that, I want to share a clip from our discussion with Parthy Loganathan on building product.
And if you think about like traditional companies, not non-software companies, that's where a lot of their spend is. It's like marketing, like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, they're spending on marketing because, I don't know, like their products are almost commoditized. Anybody can make soda. And the same thing is slowly happening to software. There's a trillion marketing SaaS companies out there. How do you stand out?
If you enjoyed this discussion with Richard, I'm sure you'll also enjoy the episode with Parthi. Parthi has also been through Y-Combinator. Check it out wherever you're listening to this podcast. It is episode number 33. Now here are my key takeaways. Number 1, when you write cold emails, write directly to one person at a time. If it reads like a bulk message, it will go straight to trash. And number 2, make sure you're solving your customer's problem end to end and not just at one part along the journey. For Fathom, this meant that the job wasn't done until the notes from the Zoom meetings were in the CRM. And that is all for this episode. If you enjoyed this discussion, the easiest way to help out is to leave a review and share with a friend. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next episode.